All right, welcome everybody to another episode of the Inside In Tennis Podcast on the Believe Network. I'm your host, Mitch Michals. As always, this podcast is available wherever you get your shows, on Apple, on Spotify, on Amazon Music, and on the YouTube page at Mitch Michals for full video episodes. Into the hardcourt season, North American hardcourt swing. There's no better time to discuss the history of the game, where the game's going, and discuss one of the best books coming out in the next couple of weeks here. By the time you listen to this, we'll be right in the danger zone of when it's about to actually come out. It's The Cruelest Game, Chasing Greatness in Professional Tennis, joined now by the author, friend of the show, Matthew Futterman, senior tennis reporter at The Athletic. Matt, what's going on? I really appreciate you coming on and talking about this exciting new book.
What's going on is I put 3 years of, blood, sweat, and tears into trying to capture what it takes to make it in professional tennis these days. Why the game seems to make all but a precious few somewhat miserable, and I think even those precious few kind of miserable at times. Why it's a uniquely maddening game, and also, sort of what the secret codes of success seem to be that, we've been sort of amazed over the last 15, 20 years or so as these great players have come through and, not effortlessly achieved levels that we never thought were possible, but achieved them with a certain level of grace and consistency and longevity. And I think if there's one sort of common thread with the younger generation, it is a sort of desperation to understand how those players did that and how that was possible. And that goes all the way from, I think Jannik Sinner and Carlos Alcaraz, who are still figuring it out, to Coco Gauff and Iga Swiatek and Sabalenka and just the whole roster down through, Rafael Hodar, who's just coming up to try and do this as well. So you really, it's the dynamic that I think sort of rules tennis these days.
Yeah, and I do appreciate you. Again, this is great to talk to the man behind the book and how the process, how you went into not just selecting who to cover, why to cover it, but also how long it took. And, you can kind of start there, Matt, right? Like there's hardly any off season for tennis players. There's also hardly any off season to work on a project like this. So 3 years, that number stands out to me. How are you able to balance that? How were you able to balance that with your duties covering the sport, the process of writing this book while you had another job to do?
Yeah, it's a lot of early mornings and late nights. And when you're a sports writer, there's really no such thing as a weekend anyway, because that's when a lot of sports happen and a lot of sports get played. And so you're sort of always on and always working, and you kind of compartmentalize, and do your best to you do your best to find chunks of time. You'd be surprised at how many writers I talk to who tell you how much writing they get done on airplanes and in airports when you're waiting for planes, because it really is sort of like a box of time when you can have some quiet and get to write and get to think.
It seems like too, and I was thinking about this just now when you were answering that. You're a reporter and you're someone that covers live sports, and not all authors, especially of long form books like this, maybe are trained or built that way. So you're used to maybe writing with noise going on. And I think some people might not be used to that, where when you say airports and writing on planes, that makes sense. Where some people just need, quiet to get their writing done. That might not be the case for someone like yourself.
I think I need both at different times. There were plenty of times in writing this book where, you just have to write it no matter what sort of mayhem is going on in the background. My desk at home is in the living room of my house. Sometimes there's a lot of stuff going on, and whether it's my wife doing a Peloton class next to me or kids yelling at each other or anything. And you sort of have to find your zone and find your quiet. There are moments though where you sort of do where I did like escape and spend some time by myself and really kind of zone in and concentrate and get some huge chunks of time together.
Yeah.
And that's what some of my vacations looked like over the last couple years.
So how do you come up with this idea of the concept, as you mentioned, trying to figure out what makes these tennis players tick, why they're able to just dedicate themselves and constantly ask the question of why they're putting themselves through this and what they're able to do for greatness? Was that something that was always on the forefront of your brain, or in times covering the sport, did you kind of stumble upon this and kind of examine why and what it might look like to dive a little further?
It's so funny. I was going back and forth for a while with both my agent and my editor, because my last book, which was a book about running, came out in 2019. And I wanted to write another book. My editor wanted me to write another book. My agent certainly wanted me to write another book. And so we were going back and forth about ideas for a while. And it was in 2023 where at some point my agent said to me, "So what's really going on in tennis?" And I kind of went on about a 15-minute rant about how all these players were completely miserable, and it was the strangest thing I'd ever seen in my career because I've covered just about every sport. I was fortunate enough to work on a really small staff at the Wall Street Journal, where it was kind of all hands on deck. And before that, at the Star Ledger in New Jersey, that was before I came to the New York Times Company, and where it was more specialized. But I covered the NFL, Major League Baseball, the NBA, NHL, all of these team sports. Individual sports. I've covered 8 or 9 Olympics. I've covered golf,
Yeah.
and of course, I had also covered tennis. And tennis was unique to me in that you had a history of players in what was their athletic prime.
Right.
Some of them, when they were number one in the world, quitting the game.
Mm.
And that is something you just do not see in any other sport. You don't see it in team sports. You don't see it. You don't really see it in golf very much. I mean, the only one I can really think of in golf maybe is like Anthony Kim, who's kind of disappeared for his own reasons, and that's been explored. But you don't have in the NBA, you don't have a Bjorn Borg or the whole string of people who have come after Bjorn Borg, who have left at the top, whether it's Kim Clijsters, Justine Henin, Harden. I mean, all these players in their mid-20s. I mean, if we think about the athletic prime as 25 to 30, who just disappear and say, no, thank you. I mean, even Pete Sampras was at an age where
31.
Aaron Judge is signing, what, a $300 million contract or something like that for the next 10 years? And he never played again. Do we think Pete Sampras had more Grand Slams in him, had other good seasons in him after winning that U.S. Open? I can tell you Paul Annacone certainly thinks he did.
I did.
So I mean, it was so unique to tennis. And here I am going on this rant again. And so like, my agent said to me, he said, "Well, why don't you just write a book about that?" And I said, "You think?" And he said, "Yeah." And so we put together a proposal. And at the time, we were coming out of, some of, Naomi Osaka's real struggles. She would have been the most sort of prescient example at the time of a player who was, if not the best in the world, very, very close to it in 21 and 22, and really was struggling to continue, and was right in that sweet spot where she should just be absolutely cleaning up. She was making $50 million a year, and she went away twice. And, one of those times she was just sleeping on her friends' couches in San Francisco and figuring out what she was going to do. And nobody knew what she was going to do next. So it was trying to figure out what was happening there. And the best way I can describe it is what I found when I talked to these people was, like I said, that sort of desperate sense among younger
Yeah.
players to figure out how the great ones, Djokovic, Federer, Nadal, Murray, Serena especially,
Yeah.
how they had survived and thrived for so long.
Yeah, another name on that women's list, Ash Barty, who walked away at the peak of her powers, wins Australia, and then just dips away.
Exactly. Yeah, I
Yeah,
should have mentioned that as well. I mentioned Osaka, but at that same time, like March of 22, right?
yeah,
Barty just ups and leaves, 25 years old. Like
crazy.
far and away at that moment, the best player, and she was done with it.
Yeah, and in the book, I think it's great too because it's formatted out where you talk about these individual players. But you mentioned Bjorn Borg, and you set the tone. Having looked at how the structure was, that Borg is the genesis for all of this because of his double digit slams and then walking away burned out. I think a lot can be said about a title, but also a concept of a book. But the Cruelest Game does put it into perspective because, not to get too negative, right? There's such beauty, and it's why we're fans of the sport. And you're chasing this euphoric greatness that you can't get anywhere else, especially if you're a world-class athlete. But the price you have to pay, and as you said, to stay fresh for so long, like the big three and Serena and the big four, everybody who's gotten to that peak has done, it takes a lot. And I think that maybe that's, Matt, where you put on your investigative side, your journalist side. Why is it that on the outside that there's such a dichotomy with how cruel the sport is, but just how euphoric it can make you when you get to the top?
Uh, I think the most important thing to remember is, even as I'm working through this, there is nirvana out there, and you see it, and people are attaching this. People are getting at this, throughout the year, multiple times. So it is happening, but it's sustaining it that is the key. That's the really important thing. Is how can it be sustained? How do you keep it? How is it not fleeting?
Yeah.
For just those precious few months, or even few weeks at times. The struggle really is how to make it so that it's not fleeting.
Right.
How do we get to this point where somebody can win and win again, and not only win and win again, but also find the joy in it? Because I think that's a big thing that we've seen with Iga over the last few years.
Right.
That the winning has kind of tortured her. The being number one, she felt the weight of it, and sustaining it has become really difficult. And as much joy as Sabalenka clearly has taken the last couple of years from being number one, you can tell how much it's weighing on her now, and how much more miserable and how much harder the losses are for her to take right now than they were before she was number one, and even in that first year of when she was number one. And I think, if you go back to Nadal especially, he seemed to really find this kind of like Zen state. And even Djokovic now, he hates losing, but he's able to shake it off and move on fairly quickly.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of that has to do with this cruel equation that tennis players go up with. They've done nothing else since they were 8 years old, for the most part, with rare exceptions. Yes, Sinner skied a lot until he was about 13 or 14, and Ben Shelton, didn't really specialize in tennis until he was 13, 14, was playing football and other sports and things like that. Most of them have done nothing else. They've homeschooled. Like, this is it. All of their family's eggs are in their basket. This is what they've got. And so there's so much riding on their success, including their identity. Like, this is how they identify themselves. And all the people around them act differently when they win than when they lose. So they grow up with this dynamic where when they win, everybody around
Yeah,
them is happy and loves them. And when they lose, there's a lot
yeah,
less love and a lot less happiness.
for
And
sure.
that sort of gets hammered into their brain and conditions them as it would anybody.
Yeah,
And it's really hard, especially because when you don't have a team around you to buck you up, like Tom Brady did.
yeah. No, and realistically, like you mentioned, the big three and what maybe separates them, Rafa being so process oriented, never really got ahead of anything, was always just there's a next match, there's something new to do. He fell in love with the process. Djokovic and Federer was on record saying the thing that he got the most improved on was how he was able to shake off losses after a tough loss. He can just turn things around. I'm glad you brought up Iga and Sabalenka and the process being 3 years, Matt, because a lot can change in 3 years, right? You writing this book, and really not even 3 years, maybe a year. But it is interesting, right? We had this premonition that we were in a new WT defined era, and we still kind of are. But in the last year, the 2026 especially, it's been tough to watch Iga play at times because the losses have been brutally worn by her. You can see it. And Sabalenka isn't at that peak, and seems like it's weighing on her. So tying it back to the book, you're writing this book, you have maybe some things in mind, some storylines in mind, and then the tennis world just zags. It's got to be something else you have to balance.
Yeah, this was the ultimate moving target. I would say that was one of the bigger challenges of the book. It, so, in a sense, things change a lot. Um, I think I both got a little bit lucky and also maybe made a couple of good decisions in sort of picking out some big themes that I didn't think were going to change. And, the first was the sort of largest theme of one generation fading out, the other one fighting to figure out how to take their place. And,
Hmm.
you know, and fortunately, you do have a sort of critical mass of players who were at the elite level. And that's what I promised when I embarked on this book to the people I was working with. It was going to be, the inside story of critical players at a critical time
Yeah,
in the sport. I wasn't going to write about, the world number 67.
sure.
You could get a lot better access to the world number 67 and you could really paint the picture of what that life is like, and that would be really interesting. But I really wanted to focus on the elite, and I wanted to focus on greatness, and I wanted to have exclusive, unique material that people weren't going to be able to get anywhere else. So that was the goal, and that was what I was shooting for. And so, for instance, I was one of the, I really, as an American, I really wanted to write about, these American men, and many
Mhm.
of them are great, and it's a great time in American men's tennis. You got a lot of guys
Yeah,
near the top, but I think what we've seen is that they may not be quite able to get to the top. And so that was so, there's a chunk of the book that I spend, sort of going deep on, Tommy, Taylor, Francis, and now Shelton,
hmm,
who I was able to get a fair bit of time with growing up, and his team. And, just sort of the idea of, Hal Shelton is, this just outrageous athlete. Um, I think he's probably the closest thing American men have had to a unicorn when it comes to just pure athletic talent and things he's able to do with a tennis racket.
yeah.
But the question is, did it start too late?
Oof.
Was he too late,
Yeah,
in terms of specializing? Because he will tell you what a terrible junior he was and how little he played from age 6 to 13, 14, and how all he really hoped and expected to do was to play for the University of Florida. Like that was his whole goal. He didn't have any designs on being a professional tennis player. He just never thought that was possible. And there wasn't anything giving him feedback or information that would
mm,
be possible because he
yeah,
was like in the
yeah.
300s as a junior. He rarely traveled out of his state, never traveled out of his region, didn't have a passport until after he graduated college. So you're trying to like feed all this information into him and feed all this stuff into his hands, to
Yeah.
see if that is possible. Um, yeah, I would have had some problems with the book if after what I thought, after I thought it was done, Ben Shelton had won a Grand Slam
That would have been interesting.
in the last year.
Yeah.
I didn't think it was going to happen. It didn't happen. And I think,
Right.
thematically, what we've seen is that, yeah, Sinner and
Mhm.
Alcaraz are incredible. It's entirely possible that um, even the younger players like Hodar and Fonseca are the ones who are going to, really push them
Yeah. Hmm.
rather than this group of 20 something Americans. Um, so
Yeah.
that's the sort of thing. That was just, you make some bets on people.
Sure.
I had gotten a lot of time with Tsitsipas and his father and that whole
Mm-hmm.
crew. And that story completely changed.
Mm-hmm.
Tsitsipas was sort of really knocking on the door when I started this book. And by the end, what we saw and it, what was interesting for a story like that is as the story changed, the material that I was getting also changed, and you saw it in a different light, and you saw how his family dynamic was really
Yeah.
weighing on him, and that a lot of the stuff his father said to me during the times I spent with him, which sort of landed in a strange way with me about how he was the only one who could really understand and get
Right.
Stefan
Right.
where he would be.
Is that
There
one where you kind of reformat certain things, like as stories changing? Are you as when you're crafting this, or is that, I don't want to say you throw stuff out, but do you have to kind of just redo the entire structure when something like that changes materially?
a little bit. I mean, if you're working, I was working on was a chapter about people whose families are deeply involved in their tennis. Um, and there's a couple, and there are real success stories in that chapter as well because I had I had spent a fair bit of time, or enough time, with Madison Keys during her Australian Open run in 2025, and with Bjorn, her then fiance, now husband, um, both there and also when he had first started coaching her. I'd been chatting with him about how that was going to work out. And also spent a lot of time with Casper Ruud and Christian Ruud talking about their dynamic. So you begin to see like the differences and what the success stories look like and the latitude in the room and what's necessary. And in the instance of Madison, what really came to light was the idea that she'd had all these coaches before
Hmm.
who were trying to teach her how to win, and trying to get her to that spot where she could win the thing that she'd never won and desperately wanted to
Yeah.
win. And what she needed Bjorn to do, and what it took someone like Bjorn to do, who is the closest person in her life, um, was he was able to sort of unconditionally give her permission to lose, uh, which was what she needed.
Take some pressure
To go
off.
down
Yeah.
swinging and take the
Yeah.
pressure off and let her be who she wanted to be and express herself on a tennis court.
Right.
And if it didn't work out, so what? They could go
Yeah.
home.
Wow.
They could go home and be happy anyway, and she could go home and be happy with herself because of what she had done on the court. And she said other coaches had told her some version of that, but she could tell they didn't really mean it. And
Mm.
when Bjorn said it, she knew she
Yeah.
knew he
Wow.
really meant it. And so, that was sort of something that really came through in that chapter of your family taking
Yeah.
care of you and being deeply involved in your career in
Yeah.
ways that I would just have a knee-jerk reaction to and say, might not be that healthy. Might not
Yeah.
be that healthy in the long run.
Yeah.
But I guess can work in certain circumstances.
We got more with Matthew Futterman here on the Inside in Tennis podcast, author of the new book coming out, The Cruelest Game, Chasing Greatness in Professional Tennis, coming out on August 4th worldwide. Matt, this is, cool for me to understand the process of how you're structuring a book and, the selection process covering players like Alcaraz, Sinner, the Americans, the American men, Coco Gauff, Novak Djokovic. Is that selection process something that, and we kind of get into it, but tough to maybe whittle down? Because as you are, I'm just a huge fan of all these storylines in tennis, and you talk about balancing out not just the players you select, but also, covering someone like Novak Djokovic who's chasing greatness but already achieved so much greatness. It's a different type of greatness and struggle that he's going through.
Yeah, it's different. I knew I was gonna have to, you knew you were gonna have to write about Novak because everyone in tennis is completely obsessed with him, especially the players. He's the Jedi Knight. He,
Yeah.
he knows how to work. He knows how to work the lightsaber better than anyone else, and so whether it's Alcaraz, you think, oh, well, Alcaraz has all the magic. He doesn't need to learn anything, but Alcaraz talks about watching Novak practice and seeing how he could only understand after watching Novak practice
Yeah.
the level of intensity and seriousness that he brought to the practice court every time, and that really sort of landed with him. We know about Novak and Sinner having a very close relationship from the time Sinner was very young, 14, 15, and being at the Piatti Academy. Mensick trained with him when he was about 16. But it's not only just the people who have the good fortune to sort of be on the court hitting with him. It's Coco Gauff watching videos of him returning and trying to figure out, how can she hit her returns deeper and better than she had been. And the list just goes on and on.
Right.
Novak's name is on everybody's lips, and part of that is also because he's very generous with other tennis players, both men and women, in terms of answering questions, helping them out. He rarely says a bad word about any other player in public. It's just like a sort of code that
Yeah.
he lives by. I think the biggest thing we've seen him do in the last few years was, when he did Shelton's hang up the phone gesture after he
Yeah.
beat him in the 2023
It
US.
takes a lot to get him to, do anything of that nature. Yeah, I'm with you there. Because
Yeah.
I also think with Novak, right, it's the evolution. It's how he evolves, but also off the court, on the court, how he balances his life at the top. And I was reading about Martina Navratilova saying she wished she would have taken a vacation, like she wished she would have just taken time off. And I'm wondering if that's going to be part of what this next generation learns is like, okay, the schedule, and we don't have to get into the schedule. It's the topic of discussion, but how you pick and choose when to turn it on and when to leave some more emotionally in the tank, let's say mentally and physically, if that's something they can learn from Novak and other greats.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, it is really important, especially with a schedule that goes 11 months and is really impossible to play throughout it. And the best players, they can't, it's because they're going deep. And I mean, you saw what happened to Sinner at the French Open. I mean, you look at what he had done before that,
Mhm.
winning Monte Carlo, winning Madrid, winning the Sunshine Double, and going to Monte Carlo, winning there, winning Madrid, going. I mean, it was just one after another. And by the time he got to Paris, like, yes, it was really hot, but he was exhausted. He was pretty tired.
Yeah.
It was sort of the perfect storm. So yes, and what you saw is his team made this calculated decision, like, we're not going to play ahead of Wimbledon. We're going to spend the time training, and the first few matches might be kind of ropey, and we're going to have to just have faith that you're good enough to get through those. And he
That's
was.
Novak, like, that when you say that, that's very, not just Novak, but the big three era of we will use this first couple matches. It's insane how good you have to be able to do this, but it's better for us to take our chances with you playing yourself into form, but coming in maybe fully physically rested.
Yeah, that's the equation that everyone is trying to balance, and especially the ones at the top. I mean, to be fair, most people don't have this issue because most people don't play 7 matches in a Grand Slam.
Right, right.
So, um, and even someone like Arena, I mean, she lost in fourth round of Wimbledon, so all of a sudden she had an extra week of rest. Coco had that at the French Open. She had an extra week there, and so sometimes you get that, you get rest when you don't want to get rest and when you least expect it. But yeah, I would say Federer is probably the one I think of who's probably was the first one to really figure out that was an essential thing to do. You go back, you remember him, it was pretty early on that he started just not playing the clay court season. He would take off the clay court season. And, he understood that was pretty important. And other players, they just, they struggle with that. They struggle with, Taylor Fritz, a perfect example, who just, he will grind himself into oblivion and very nearly did this spring. And would have done it more had his team not said, you can go, but we're not going with you. So yeah, that is a real challenge. And that's one of, that's one of the codes that you got to figure out is, what does my body need right now? And what is more important than what my body needs right now, but what does my head need right now? How do I just sort of decompress? Because I think, as we've talked about before, the crucible of playing a tennis match and being alone on that court is something that is unique in sports. Boxers have cornermen, golfers have caddies. Tennis players go out there pretty much alone, and I don't really care how close the coach is sort of sitting in the stands, until that coach is sitting physically next to a player, like they do in Davis Cup, for instance.
Right.
It's different.
Yeah. It is very interesting too, right? The reviews of this book are very positive across the board. John Wertheim is one that said it's, psychology as much as tennis. And I do think that that's the side of the game that even today, even with all we know, we still don't fully concept how much psychologically goes into being great at this sport. So if you were a young tennis player, or maybe somebody that's recreationally playing the game, reading this book, what do you think they can learn about what these top flight tennis players are experiencing?
Well, I think the main thing that they experience, and that you see what really tortures these players, is when the results become their identity, rather than just information. So, and that's really important. And like I've said to other people, this is a book that's as much for tennis parents as it is for tennis players in some sense. I was lucky enough to be stuck in New York rush hour traffic in a luxury Suburban with Andre Agassi a couple of years ago, and was able to have a very long conversation as we made our way from the National Tennis Center back into Midtown Manhattan, sort of about his experience of the game, both technically and psychologically. And, he talked about, the idea of how important it was for a parent to, have the same reaction whether a child wins or loses. You get ice cream after a win, you get ice cream after a loss. If your kid wins, yeah, you can smile, but don't be rising out of your seat and celebrating and pumping your fist, because you're not going to be doing that when your kid loses. And what he says is like, what very quickly happens, and he experienced it himself, is that this relationship we have is dependent on what I do on a tennis court.
Yeah.
That love and joy only comes when I win, and it won't be there if I lose. And so I think, some of those things are really important for people to understand and people to have that level of security around them. And when you sort of hear that from Andre, and then you go around and you spend time with Sinner's team and people like Vignazzi and Cahill, and you see, how they act, whether he wins or loses, and, where his parents fit into that structure. His parents aren't around very much. His dad still is occasionally cooking at the restaurant in the Alps, even though he's mostly retired. His mother, they're small town people. They don't like to go. And then you see, you compare that to what Alcaraz has on his shoulders, and he's got, he's got a lot of people, and he's got a father who's always there, and a brother who's always there, and his agent telling him to do this and that. And there's a different experience that those two players seem to be having going through their tennis careers, and that other players have. So you begin to see how not just these players are functioning, but also their teams are functioning, and what feels healthy and what feels unhealthy.
Well, Matt, I can't wait to read the book, The Cruelest Game, out on August 4th. Really appreciate you taking time coming on the podcast, and hopefully, we can talk again in the coming months when this book is in circulation. But as I said before, honored to have you on the show, and can't wait to put it on the shelf when it's done. So really appreciate you coming on the podcast.
Thanks so much. That'll be heady company when if I make it to that shelf. So really appreciate it.
That was Matt Futterman, senior tennis writer for The Athletic. We are the Inside in Tennis podcast on all your podcast platforms. The YouTube channel's at Mitch Michals. Just find the show on Apple, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. Download it, subscribe. Make sure you follow us covering the game of tennis going forward. Great show this week. More content coming in the weeks to come. For Matt Futterman, I'm Mitch Michals. Thanks for listening to the Inside in Tennis podcast, and I will talk to you soon.